As I say, Alan is my counterpart as the director of the Water Resources Research Institute in Idaho. Dr. Kolok holds a doctorate in environmental, population, and organismic biology from the University of Colorado at Boulder, master's degree in fisheries and aquatic science from the University of Washington State in Seattle, and a bachelor's degree in zoology from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Kolok hails from Nebraska. We won't hold that against him. Where he was director of the Nebraska Watershed Network at Nebraska Omaha and the Center for Environmental Health and Toxicology at the Nebraska Medical Center. His interests span the water, food, energy nexus, particularly as it relates to public health. Description of his talk is a quick summary. Water allocation in the face of energy demand and food production is a wicked problem, as the issues are nuanced and convoluted and highly political. Despite the complexity, adding public health to the conversation is essential and will help elucidate our critical pathway forward. Alan, please.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Right before, Peter can testify to this, right before we were getting ready to give the talk today, this should queue up right now, we were asked, do you ever get nervous before you give a talk? And Peter said, yeah, I get nervous sometimes when I'm talking in front of huge crowds at national TEDx things and stuff like that, which makes total sense. I get nervous when I have to follow people like Peter. I mean, that's a tough act to follow. Let's see, where are we? Let's go. Yep. All right, cool. But, you know, I was thinking about this while I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, Peter's talking about fun and play, and I'm going to talk about pediatric cancer. Not so good right before lunch, right? Not so good. But then, you know, recognize, I mean, obviously, there's nothing fun or playful about pediatric cancer. But I promise you, there will be a point in here when fun, play, community involvement, community engagement play a central role. And if I can remember it, I will bring that up when we get there. And it is not trivial, and it is really central to what I'm talking about today. So we will get there. Bear with me, but we will get to that point. So I'm going to talk today about this idea of the water, energy, food nexus, bringing public health to the table. Food, energy, water nexus is like the 5 blind men and the elephant, right? And that is, you all know the old tale, right? 5 blind men are led into a room, there's an elephant there, and they say, tell me what is it? One guy touches the side and says it's a wall. One person touches the tail and says it's a rope. One person touches the tusk and says it's glass. One person touches the trunk and says it's a snake, right? Nuanced. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can look at food, energy, water, public health nexus, how these things interact with each other. I particularly like this. This is out of the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in 2014. And effectively, they came up with this definition, right? The food, energy, water nexus is about balancing different research goals and interests within the food and energy sectors while maintaining the integrity of aquatic ecosystems. I like that definition. So we're trying to balance food production, water use, the economy. We're trying to balance all that stuff and not damage the environment irreversibly or too much. Kind of interesting. Well, I'm going to just take a sideline here for a second. I live in Moscow, Idaho. Moscow, Idaho is about an hour and a half from Spokane, the nearest large international airport, which means to get here for dinner last night at 7, I left my house at 3:30 a.m. I got here at 7 last night. I literally drove right to the restaurant, walked in, had a dinner with the steering committee, then ran over and saw Nancy's talk. Thanks a lot, Nancy, because now I'm listening to your talk, and your talk's all about the food, energy, water nexus, just based upon Louisiana, right? And this nexus between energy, water, and food. And I said, thanks a lot, Nancy, meaning, thanks a lot, I'm exhausted, now I gotta go back and make a new slide and bring you into the talk today. So here it is, right? So so I have to go back and I have to start thinking about, oh God, she was exactly talking about this nexus between food, right, shrimp and corn, right, her shrimp corn chowder, energy, right, she mentioned by name in the talk, right, she specifically talked about biofuels, right, and water. So she's pulling it all together. I'm thinking, oh wow, that's really interesting. She also was talking about nitrobucks, and I really like that, and I'm going to use that somewhere later on in my future, including today, because nitrobucks is just cool. And as she said yesterday, it's a whole lot better than P-bucks, but nitrobucks is just cool, and I will use that. So particularly since Idaho also has a nitrate problem. So that will come up again, I can guarantee you that. The central point of my talk today is this, right? We got to bring in, and I'm sorry, I'm a Venn diagram fan. We have to bring public health into this conversation. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll see why, and hopefully you will agree. Now, before we do that, and also, let me just add again, a little teaser, I promise you I will bring fun and play into this. It's coming. It's not the central point of what I'm talking about, but it's there, and it will show up. However, before we do that, I'm an academic. I was, as was said in the introduction, I was an academic in the University of Nebraska system for 20 years. So I'm going to go a little bit academic on you here, and I'm going to evoke your academic past. We know that water and public health are intimately related to each other. You all know that. You all know that intuitively, but you also know that, academically, right? And if you remember back to your classes, you know that this is true. In fact, the first nexus, if you will, between water and public health comes from the first environmental epidemiology, and indeed the first epidemiological study in history. And that study came out of the 1800s in London. Nothing fun about cholera either. But it comes out of the Broad Street cholera outbreak, right? And in 1854, cholera kills 127 Londoners living near the Broad Street water pump. The blue star is where the pump was. The red are the incidences of cholera where these people died. John Snow, I'm not making the guy's name up, and if you've had an epidemiology class, you might remember that name. John Snow was the doctor. He was really credited to be the first epidemiologist, and he put together the map. Didn't have GIS back then, but he put together the map and traced it back to the pump. Now, one of the coolest things was he was not just a scientist, he was also a remediator. And so what he did is he solved it. And how did he solve it? And again, I'm not making this point up either. He took the pump handle off. He went out with a wrench and he took the pump handle off. By doing that, he literally saved scores, if not hundreds of people's lives. It's totally cool. So you have an epidemiologist who then winds up being a practitioner, public health practitioner in the field, saving people's lives. Pretty neat. So water, public health have been linked together ever since somebody started thinking about public health, right? I mean, it goes all the way back to the dawn of epidemiology. Now, fast forward I just have to go back to make sure I have my math, 1850, 2018, fast forward 170 years, and Flint, Michigan lead outbreak. All right, as you all know, made the news, and unless you were sleeping, we're all aware of the tragedy of Flint, Michigan, right, in April 2014. Flint, Michigan changed its water supply from Detroit supplied Lake Huron water to the Flint, getting it from the Flint River for very specific reasons. That increased lead occurrence in the water, leading to hundreds of children winding up intoxicated, generating lead toxicity, which creates irreversible neuronal damage. Unfortunately, there's no pump. You know, there's no pump where you can go out, take the handle off, and solve this problem. Way more convoluted, way more nuanced than that. And I put in McClellan Street for this very reason. What happened was after they generated the map, right, the map of the different wards where the lead toxicity was, after they generated the map, they went to the houses that were the most highly contaminated. For example, on McClellan Street, this is not the house, but this is, I Googled it, I pulled down a house. This is a house that is on McClellan Street in Flint, Michigan, but it's not the house. But there is a house on this street that has lead in their drinking water at 1,000 ppb, 65 times greater than the EPA standard. And they thought, oh man, this house has to be number one on the list. We're going to dig up the lead plumbing coming into this house, and we're going to solve the problem. They did the excavation, and the entry pipes coming into the house are copper. Changing those. There's no simple solution. It's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as taking a pump handle off. All right. What I really wanted to talk about today, and what I'm going to talk about, the predominant bulk of what I'm going to talk about today is this connection, right? This connection between water, food, water and food, through water used for irrigation, generation of food, and the associated agrochemicals that are the flotsam and jetsam of that relationship, right? And here, there's nitrogen, phosphorus, of course, and you may not recognize these chemicals, so starting over on the right, we have glyphosate, atrazine, tetracycline, and trenbolone. Two out of the cattle industry, two out of corn soybean rotation. Right? These chemicals wind up in the environment, and as many of you are very well aware, that's not a good thing. It leads to newspaper articles such as this, 2009 out of St. Louis Post-Dispatch, common weed killer atrazine showing up in public water supply. Atrazine is a known endocrine disruptor, and it has feminizing capacity, which you certainly wouldn't want a fetus to be exposed to during its periods of development. Des Moines Waterworks, very near and dear to where we are right now, right? And many of you are much more aware of this than I am. Des Moines Waterworks starts nitrate removal facility, operating costs exceed over $1.5 million annually. That's the kind of water, food, agricultural nexus that we don't want to have happening, right? This is a large economic drain on the city of Des Moines, as many of you are well aware. Just a couple more. Debate over Costco plant in Fremont. Fremont, Nebraska is thinking of bringing in a confined animal feeding operation with 17 million chickens. That's going to make a mess. And how are they going to deal with that from the perspective of their riverine environments? And then finally, what Nancy was talking about last night, the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, 2017 is the largest dead zone that's been recorded. So there is an issue here, right? And it's a nexus between water, agricultural food production, cycling back to water with the potential for either economic or public health adverse outcome that we really don't want to have occur. I'm going to pick today on atrazine in the Mississippi River Basin as our sentinel compound to talk about. And I realize that atrazine is polarizing, and I realize that that some of the impacts of atrazine might be controversial. However, the real reason that I'm talking about atrazine, which we'll get at later, and believe it or not, it actually does get towards the fun part of this, is that there are very easy to use capacities by which people can measure atrazine at home. So if you were concerned about in the spring, does my well or does my drinking water contain atrazine, you could make that test very, very easily and inexpensively, and you wouldn't have to send those water samples out. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. But relative to atrazine, atrazine, as many of you are aware, is the second most commonly used herbicide in the world. Known endocrine disruptor causing adverse impacts on both animals and humans. Very similar to global climate change. There may be some political disagreement. However, if you look at body of evidence, there's a tremendous amount of body of evidence out there relative to the scientific literature that supports these adverse impacts in both animals, principally aquatic animals, fish and frogs, and also in humans. And as you're also probably well aware, it's commonly used throughout the Corn Belt of the Midwestern United States, which I'm going to talk about in some considerable detail today, notwithstanding the fact that I'm in Iowa, but because I spent 20 years in Nebraska. All right. Here's the great state of Nebraska. This is a land use map, and as many of you are probably well aware, the state of Nebraska runs from a xeric environment in the west to a much more mesic environment in the east, with both the dark green and the light green being the areas of high corn soybean rotation, high agricultural input. If I'm going to focus today and talk a lot about this watershed in the little red oval is the Elkhorn River watershed. This is the closest contiguous watershed, all in the state of Nebraska, to the University of Nebraska, Omaha, which is down pretty close to Fremont, down in the lower right-hand corner. And this was a great watershed to work in, 10,000 square kilometers, 300 linear miles of river. The water runs from the Sandhills, which is up in the north west, which would be the upper left-hand side of this map, upward by O'Neill, where there's sandhills, not a whole lot of corn soybean rotation. The water then runs down from the sandhills down into the lowland plains in Norfolk, in that area where there would be high levels of corn soybean rotation. One other point, when I was the founding director of the Nebraska Watershed Network, we initiated this Elkhorn River Research Station, which was on the very bottom of this overall watershed. And now I'd kind of like to go a little bit of kind of Nancy Robillard on you just for a few minutes and kind of talk about what we were able to do at this station. So at this station, before we started work at the station, there were a lot of questions relative to the fate and transport of agrochemicals, and specifically the fate and transport of atrazine, that we really didn't have a good bead on. And one thing that we realized very quickly, so we were able to make measurements of atrazine at this station relatively inexpensively and very frequently. And one thing that we realized very rapidly was during the spring, there was a direct relationship between river discharge and atrazine concentration in the water. And the way that we delineated atrazine concentration is we looked at the presence or absence of atrazine according to these test strips that we could get, that you could use at your home for $10 a sample. And we used these to look at how it was related to river discharge. And what we saw was effectively, and it's not rocket science, but every time it would rain right? A rain, river discharge would go up, and during the formative months of the spring, atrazine would appear in overabundance, exceeding this US EPA drinking water threshold of 3 parts per billion, and it would stay up for a considerable amount of time. So here, the red are measurements where atrazine was not found. The green are measurements where atrazine was found. And as you can see, again, every time we get a spike in discharge during the spring, on the down, the reducing side of that curve, we generally get positive hits for atrazine. So it's highly related to discharge. Kind of interesting. The other interesting thing, and again, my point here is not to give an atrazine talk. I'm not Tyrone Hayes. That's not the point. But the point is, and the value of atrazine is 2 things. First of all, again, there's this very inexpensive metric that we can use to look at the occurrence of the chemical. And the second thing is, atrazine is Batman. See, that's kind of fun. Atrazine is like this superhero, right? And what I mean by that is you never just find Batman. Whenever Batman is there, you find his whole suite of cohorts, Robin and Batgirl and Catwoman and Joker. You find them all, right? So there's high correlation between the presence of atrazine and the presence of a whole number of other agrochemicals. So here, if we look during this 7-day window, when we have a series of positive hits right around May 8, right, we see very high concentrations of a number of different agrochemical compounds. If we look out here where you have a series of negative results for atrazine, the concentration of the other compounds also drops off dramatically. So I don't particularly care about implicating atrazine in anything. I just use atrazine as a sentinel chemical for overall suite of agrochemicals in the watershed. So I think from that perspective, it's really, really interesting. The other point is these chemicals are not benign. So here's the same time frame relative to discharge. If we expose animals in the station during to river water, during the period when atrazine and the other chemicals are there, we see endocrine disrupting effects. We see reductions in the gene expression of estrogen responsive genes in these animals. So the females, this is actually a female fathead minnow, the females are actually defeminized. They're less feminine than they were before. If we look during a period of when the chemicals aren't there, obviously we don't see it. We don't see anything. So these chemicals are not benign, and we can show that in the field very easily. So where are we? We're at the point where we know that when we have discharge, when we have rain events, discharge increases during the spring. That's going to lead to a pulsive chemical. Well, what about if we start looking at that annually? Instead of looking at it as one season, let's look at it as over multiple years. And what you can see here, and let me just walk you through this slide, this is basically just the spring from 2011 to 2016. The blue is negative for atrazine, negative of this detectability, right? The green is positive. And as you can see, just looking down the years, tremendous amount of variation from one year to the next. Well, how come? Well, the answer is just the same answer that we had before. It's discharge, right? 2011 was which is the blue line here relative to discharge. 2011, low discharge, a low temporal milieu of positive hits for atrazine. 2016, high discharge, many more occurrences temporally of positive hits for atrazine. So again, it's all related to discharge. So if you want to answer the question that Nancy Robillard posed last night, how do we keep our corn and shrimp chowder? Just don't let any water go down the Mississippi River, and we're all fine, right? If we can reduce that discharge, everything's fine. Now let's take that idea of this temporal variation And let's start to look at it spatially. All right, let's start to open this up and look at it over a larger geography. Again, here's our watershed. And now, this will take a little bit of explanation, but now what we did is we looked at 3 different areas within the watershed. The sandhills, the area around Norfolk, and the area around Fremont, which would be the research station. So if we look up here, now these are energy bars, all right? And compare this energy bar to this energy bar. Right? So it's like the little energy bar you have in your cell phone, right? Blue, again, is negative for atrazine. Now, in this case here, this doesn't mean that it's negative for atrazine at one location. What it means is we've looked at 20, 30 different locations in the sandhills, and then we just amalgamated, so we're looking at a proportion, right? A percent of positive or negative hits. In the sandhills, we see no positive hits during 2011. Down around Fremont, we're seeing about 30% positive hits. Down around Omaha, we're seeing about 70% positive hits. So as that water runs through the watershed, which makes a lot of sense because there's less corn, therefore less atrazine up in the sandhills, right? As that water moves downstream, it's picking up atrazine, and the percent of positive hits is going up. Now compare that to what we see in 2016. 2016 was a much rainier year, a lot more positive hits of atrazine at the Elkhorn station, and we're seeing about 80% up in the sandhills, about 60% in Fremont, and about 90% down here in Omaha. So again, discharge is running the roost, right? When you have high discharge, it is increasing the number of hits. It's also increasing the geospatial capacity of those hits, right? You see it across the entire watershed. I like this idea about a wicked problem, right? This food-water connection as being a wicked problem. And I show this slide all the time, and this is effectively the tributaries of the waterways within the United States. And as Nancy was talking about last night, the Mississippi-Missouri watershed makes up about 60% of the overall square mileage of watersheds within the lower 48 of the United States. Now there's a lawyer by the name of Lazarus out of Cornell, and he came up with this idea of environmentally wicked problems. And what he said relative to environmentally wicked problems was that, first of all, they have a vast geography. And I would consider this, the Mississippi-Missouri River watershed, a vast geography, right? The problem has multiple sources. Every single cornfield in the Corn Belt could potentially be a source for atrazine in the water, or nitrates or phosphates, the things that Nancy was talking about yesterday. The problem doesn't remain static. It has a high temporal component. It has a high spatial component as well. So it's not a static problem. And solutions that would work today may not work tomorrow. And this, I think a question came up to Nancy last night about tipping points. And there are such things as environmental tipping points where when it goes over the edge, you can't come back. Now, when you look at this slide, most of you probably think, if you can kind of divorce yourself from the topic at hand today, most of you probably think that this slide and what Lazarus was really talking about, Lazarus wasn't a water resources person. Lazarus was a lawyer, and he was talking predominantly about global climate change. Right? But I would argue that when we start thinking about massive watersheds, and water quality in massive watersheds, the things Nancy was talking about last night, things I'm talking about today, these are wicked problems. How we solve those problems are really convoluted and really difficult to get a handle on. So again, I would argue that the Corn Belt, atrazine, and the Mississippi River water basin is a wicked problem that's going to take some unusual capacity to be able to get a handle on. Probably familiar with this slide. This is the Corn Belt, and like Nancy was saying last night, I'm not implicating any state, but when I see Iowa on here, I don't see a whole lot of area that's not red, and this is areas that are under potential for corn rotation. Whoops, sorry. Again, here's the corn belt, just put it in the context of the US. And again, just to remind you, here is this large watershed. So how is drainage from these areas impacting this entire watershed? This is where the fun comes in, and I'm serious about this. This is a wicked problem, and one of the arguments that Lazarus makes is wicked problems require unconventional solutions. And one unconventional, so let me just back up for a second and make the point that when I say that, the problem is we would like to have simultaneous sampling that occurs where we have hundreds, if not thousands of samples collected all on the same day across this enormous geography. How are we going to do that? The feds can't do that. The states aren't going to cooperate with each other to do that. Any census group or municipality smaller than on the state level doesn't have the money to do that. So it seemingly is an impossible problem. We need to simultaneously collect on a single day thousands of samples. How are we going to do that? Well, this is where it gets to Peter's talk. We're going to evoke the community. We're going to get citizen scientists armed with this tool of this simple atrazine detection strip. The strips cost $10. They take 10 minutes to incubate, and they give you the same kind of results that you get from a pregnancy test strip, right? 2 lines, the rabbit died. 1 line, the rabbit's still alive, right? So 2 lines, you're pregnant. 1 line, you're not. 2 lines, you exceed the US EPA drinking water standard for atrazine. 1 line, you don't. It's really an elegant tool. It's also EPA certified. So this is not a toy. This is real. You're doing real analytical chemistry at home, just like when you use a pregnancy testing strip or an ovulation testing strip. You're doing real chemistry. I mean, there's some real serious chemistry underlying what you're measuring. Same thing here. So by evoking the community and telling the community, and the one point that I would differ, as if I recall from his talk, relative to what Peter was saying, the one point I would differ with him in what he said was, I think he said something along the lines of, people can't really interact in their watersheds if you're talking about watersheds that are really large because they're so large and they're so hard to get their hands around. Yeah, you actually can. And we can mobilize communities, whether those communities are US communities, communities in developing countries. We can mobilize communities to go out, make measurements, and have those measurements be scientifically valid. And geek scientist that I am, that's my definition of fun, right? I mean, if you can get people to go out and make measurements that actually have feedback into their personal lives, that's really empowering. And empowerment is, if you look at it in a funny way, empowerment is one kind of manifestation of a healthy community. All right, so I told you I would get there, and I would get to the fun part, and there it is, right? But don't get too happy, because we're still going to talk about pediatric cancer, so don't get too excited. All right, and we did this work. We actually did this work up and down the Mississippi River from Lake Itasca in Minnesota all the way down to New Orleans. We did this in 2014. We also did it in 2016. We did a one-day sampling of atrazine featuring citizen scientists collecting all of the data within a 24-hour period. At the end of the one day, we had 202 usable data points collected from 7 states. I don't know what's up with Arkansas, but they just didn't want to play. But everybody else worked along with us. And this is what we found. In the far north in Minnesota, we had 26 data points collected. We didn't see any atrazine anywhere. It may have been that it was a little too early in the season. Northern Illinois, about 10%. St. Louis, about 26%. The Ohio River, and again, I keep coming back to it because there's so much consistency between what the two of us were saying. If you remember last night when Nancy was talking, a lot of the primary contributor of nitrogen into the Gulf of Mexico is coming out of the Ohio River. Same thing here. A lot of the contribution of atrazine coming into the Mississippi River is coming out of the Ohio. Right? We said almost 50% of all the sites that we sampled were positive for atrazine. In the Ohio River, down in Louisiana, we didn't see anything. I'm not going to show you the 2016 results because it was very similar, but I will show you the composite. So here the pink are the states that use atrazine. The dark red and the dark blue are the states that are in the Corn Belt. The light blue are the states that we measured in this citizen science campaign that measured atrazine where they didn't see very much. And the dark blue are the Corn Belt states that we had involved in our atrazine campaign. And you can see on a national scale, the highest incidence of atrazine in the Mississippi River correlate very strongly with areas of the country where atrazine use is the greatest. Now, you may say, it kind of gets back to what Peter was saying, you may say, well, you know, I mean, I could have told you that before you did the study. Places where they use it, you're going to see it in the water. Places where you don't, you're not going to see it in the water. Yeah, but tell that to the 500 people that we had to go out and make these measurements. Tell that to the Boy Scout troop kids and the high schoolers and the senior citizens who own land on the Mississippi River. Tell them that it's not important. They think it's really damn important because they are empowering their communities to go out and make those kind of measurements. So we can start looking at these globally wicked problems, and we can evoke the global community to contribute to that. And as I said before, I was an academic at the University of Nebraska for 20 years. And I think that statement that I just said, you know, we can use the global community to address global environmental problems. That's the one that I would want to have impressed upon my tombstone, right? I mean, that's really, if I've done anything, that's where I think I've really made a contribution that I think is really long-lasting. So what Peter's been talking about, what I'm talking about, really aren't that different from each other. Okay. So let's talk about cancer. Let's talk about a downer, but let's bring public health into this conversation. All right, so now we're going to talk about these wicked problems. We're going to talk about the same subset that I just talked about, right? Water, food production, agrochemicals, water contamination, right? We're going to talk about that same nexus. But now let's pull public health into that. Because if we can start to make environmental measurements that are nationwide in scope, or at least basin-wide in scope, now again, and I know that many of you are not public health professionals, but now again, we start getting the hair on the back of necks of epidemiologists starts to stand up because they think now, when we're starting to talk on those kind of levels, not the Elkhorn River, 300 linear miles, 10,000 square miles, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the entire Mississippi floodplain. How many millions of people are we talking about? I don't have an answer for that, but I know it's a lot, right? I mean, we're up in the 40, 50 million people. Epidemiologists start doing this with their hands because it's like now we have a sample size where we can start to actually say something about what these individuals are exposed to and whether or not those chemicals matter to the lives of those individuals. I'm not here to argue today that it matters or not. That's not my point. My point is that we can kind of go either epidemiology or water resources 2.0 and start asking questions between the interdigitation between public health and water that we have never been able to ask before in history. And again, the way that we do it is we evoke the community, which I think is really cool. All right, let me just point a couple of wicked assets of this problem. And a great way to do it is to compare the lead contamination in Flint, Michigan to and I'm just using the term, and I don't, I'm not trying to say anything political here, but let's look at agrochemical contamination in the Mississippi River as a potential public health concern relative to Flint, Michigan, and their concern relative to lead. And let's just do a side-by-side comparison. Lead, domestic, right? A domestic source. Pesticide, environmental source. Environmental meaning that it's not coming from we all know that the problem with Flint was domestic. It was erosion of the lead in the pipes. The problem with pesticide contamination, if there is one, is that it's environmental, right? It's not part of the supply chain, it's pre-supply. So that's what I mean by environmental. Geography. The lead problem is a local problem. With all due respect to Flint and the mothers of children in Flint that are damaged, with all due respect to them, and I mean that sincerely, it's a local problem. If you live in Detroit, and you're 20 miles away, you don't have that problem. You're sad, it's tragic, you're sad, you're disappointed, you're maybe angry at the government, but you don't have that problem. This pesticide contamination is either a regional or a national problem, depending on how you look at it. Or in other words, it's one of those Lazarus-esque wicked problems. Exposure. The lead contamination is a direct exposure, right? You open the tap, you drink the water, you're exposed to lead. How does the lead from the Elkhorn River, how does a person get exposed to the agrochemicals in the Elkhorn River or the Mississippi? It's a much more tenuous line of exposure, if there is one at all. And finally, latency period. If you're a child and you're consuming lead-tainted water, lead-contaminated water, you're going to see neurological issues fairly soon, weeks to months after you start drinking that water, because it's going to impair the development of your neurons. For a latency period relative to ag chemicals, if you're talking about cancer, you could be talking about 40 years down the road. Who's going to remember? What was your experience with the Elkhorn River back in 1973? Who knows? Well, I went boating 3 times, right? Who's going to remember? Pardon me, but latency period is a bitch, right? It really makes it extremely difficult to make any kind of connection. So talk about a wicked public health problem. This is a hugely wicked public health problem. And I'm not saying the problem is there's certainly an issue and prove it. I'm saying it's a wicked problem, and it's almost impossible to know whether there's an issue or not, because you have these nuanced factors that are convoluting the question. Doesn't mean it's not worth studying. It just means that it's more difficult to get your head around. Again, here's the Corn Belt in the U.S. I just wanted to show you this to illustrate the problem. This is an incidence map of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Is there a relationship to the Corn Belt? And here, blue is good, right? Blue is low incidence, red is bad, high incidence. Is there a relationship to the Corn Belt? I don't know. Looking at that map, you're painting with a pretty thick brush. Yeah, you look at, and again, I'm not picking on any specific state, but you look at Iowa, you look at southern Minnesota, there's a lot of red on there. But are you going to take that to a court of law? Are you going to take that to the governor of the state and say, hey, we got a problem here, and it's agrochemicals causing influence on non-Hodgkin? No way. They would, if they were polite, they would laugh you out of your office. If not, they would grab you by your shirt tails and throw you out of their office, right? I mean, you can't make that relationship. It's a problem, and my whole point is these are not simple problems to look at. These latency periods and these indirect exposures really complicate the public health part about it. Well, what can we do? Well, one thing that we can do is say, all right, and again, I'm sorry, I'm talking like a toxicologist, so I just assume no one ever got cancer. And if I had a magic wand and I could make all cancers go away everywhere, I would do so right now, but I can't. But what we can say is, all right, if we're going to look at a cancer, or if we're going to look at a disease or an etiology, which is our poster child? What should we look at? Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that people get when they're 80 years old? Yes, it's tragic, but from an epidemiological perspective, really difficult to tease out. Let's lower that latency period. Well, how can you lower the latency period? Birth defects. Birth defects, the mom's exposed, the baby's born, the baby is born, the doctor looks at the baby and says, oh, I'm just using this as one example, you got a cleft palate, or you have a hypospadia. The opening of the penis isn't at the end of the penis, it's on the side, right? Those kind of things you can, the maximum amount of latency period there is 9 months, right? So you've really reduced the latency period. Birth defects are pretty darn important. 3% of all babies born have a birth defect. I'm not saying that they're all caused by exposure to exogenous chemicals. In fact, it's very clear that that's not true. Folic acid is a nutritional concentration of folic acid is huge in birth defects, but not all types of birth defects, right? So I'm not trying to point the finger at any one outcome, but I'm just making the point that highly prevalent, short latency period. Really good place. If you're going to look, this would be a disease that you would want to look at. Again, with all due respect to Peter, nothing fun about this, nothing playful about this. But if you're going to go down this game, this is a way that you could really do it and do so effectively. And you could match water quality to public health outcome. So also in fetal development, there are well-established windows of sensitivity. The limb buds develop or don't develop in humans at a very specific gestational age. And if those children are exposed to thalidomide, which is a pharmacological compound which children and fetuses in the UK were exposed to, their long limbs, their legs and arms don't develop. Likewise, diethylstilbestrol, if an infant is exposed to diethylstilbestrol, particularly a female, and she's exposed at exactly the wrong time, her reproductive system will develop abnormally and leading to a number of abnormalities that are anywhere from very minor to life-threatening, including cervical cancer. So my whole point of this is, again, the case for looking at the fetus as the most sensitive life cycle point within the human life cycle. This has been done. This is some work that's been done by Winchester just a few years ago. And what he did is he was trying to match atrazine to prevalence of birth defects. But look at these data. What he's actually showing here is he's showing nationwide, the entire United States, California, Florida, Rhode Island, right? Places that don't use a whole lot of atrazine. And he's trying to measure that relative to micrograms per liter of atrazine, again, nationwide. So he's painting with this enormously thick brush. And what he's trying to say is, when atrazine occurrence in the water, in raw water, natural water, increases, birth defects go up. Good science, bad science, ridiculous, throw this paper away, really, really important. I'm not here to judge that. I'm not trying to make a statement either way. And in fact, I am a little bit. This is pretty coarse, right? But my point is, this is about as good as it has gotten. This paper was published in Acta Pediatrica in 2009. That's a pretty good journal relatively recently ago. And this is cited frequently. My whole point is, we can do better than this. we can do better, just excuse me for a moment, right? Yeah, got it. We can do better than this, and we can do better than this. So just real quickly, how do we do that, right? And I just want to talk just briefly about some work that we're doing, looking at the covariation between birth defect incidence in Nebraska and land use. One problem epidemiologists have is that this is just a population density map of the state of Nebraska. And there's two problems. Problem one is population density is not uniform across the state. Problem two is that there are large areas where basically in Nebraska where nobody lives, right? The rural areas of western Nebraska, there's a bunch of cows and that's about it, right? Nobody's living there. That makes it really hard when you're trying to do epidemiological studies. The other point, let's look at this, and I'm sorry, there's no real good way to illustrate this, but what this is this is the census tract of counties, which is in black, superimposed on watersheds, which is purple. And as you can tell, watersheds roll in and out of counties, just like they roll in between and in and out of states. How are you going to do any kind of epidemiological delineation if all the epidemiologists focus on census tracts, counties, states, and they're not focusing on watersheds? Real quickly, state of Nebraska, Elkhorn River. This map is the birth defect incidence in Nebraska by watershed. This is some work that a bunch of individuals at the College of Public Health and I just published a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact. And again, this is a heat map. The darker the color, the greater the incidence. Very high incidence of birth defects in my foundational watershed, the Elkhorn River watershed. Kind of interesting. We also looked at pediatric cancers, same thing. Pediatric cancers and birth defects. And these are data that we collected much, much later, as far as going back to the health records, pulling out those health incidences. These are data that we just did way after we were implicating the Elkhorn River. So it's not as if we were trying to point anything at the Elkhorn River. That was not the point. It's just kind of an interesting point that's come out of this. Is this the kind of the end point? No, this is really just the beginning. If we start thinking about public health from a watershed perspective, instead of from a census tract perspective, and if we start evoking the communities to get involved in both water quality remediation, and their own public health, I think we're really onto something. So impacts on the public health need to be considered when dealing with the food, water, energy nexus. Combining the forces of water resource specialists with public health professionals may be a valuable way to move forward. And with that, I'll stop. And thank you very much. Thanks.
This clock is 5 minutes fast, the one you're looking at here. So a quick question.